Welcome everybody to the second in our series about birds inside and out. I think we're off to a good start last week with Professor Ken Dial, and I'm very, very excited about tonight's lecture as well. First, my usual task is just to ask you to make certain you've turned off your cell phones so they don't embarrass you. I usually have to run down and turn mine off just after I say that. So, also to remind you that all of the proceedings are being taped by MCAT and will be available for viewing on television after the series is over, and we'll be able to let you know the schedule as always as the series moves on. We will be having our usual festivity at the end of the last night's lecture, so please show up. I don't know what it's going to have to do with birds, but at least we'll have wine and cheese, I think. So that's always a favorite, no matter what the subject is. So thank you all for being here. It's really a wonderful thing to see such a turnout. I'm going to introduce my dear colleague, Eduardo Chirinos, who is going to come and read from his book, 39 Zoological Lessons and Other Didactic Poems. And I'll ask Eduardo, would you come on up, please? Eduardo couldn't be here last week because he was in Mexico to celebrate the celebration of the Spanish edition of his book, which has just come out. Yay, it's a beautiful book. And soon we'll be able to get our hands on a bilingual edition. Correct, Eduardo? The bilingual edition will come soon. Okay, and I also want to introduce tonight David Miles Lusk. David, would you stand up? This is our artist. Let's give him a big round of applause. David couldn't be here last week either, I think, but I'm very, very glad to meet him, and he's a lively artist here in Missoula. He graduated from the University of Montana in 2014. So David, thanks for being here, and thanks for your work. It's really quite splendid. So I'm going to ask Eduardo now to read one of his poems in Spanish, and then just like last week, Jeff Badenoch will be reading the English translation. Then I'll come up and introduce Bret, and we'll be on our way. Okay, Eduardo.
Good evening, everybody. Tonight I will read a poem whose speaker is 9 feet tall. An enormous bird called Dinornis robustus in Latin. Well, this bird is extinct and lives in New Zealand as a little kiwi. This is a poem. Dinornis robustis. Vinimos a pie a esta isla mucho antes de que se dividiera en dos, mucho antes de que se llamara Aotearoa. Las alas las perdimos, ya no recordamos cuándo, ni siquiera conservamos sus vestigios. ¿Para qué? Nuestras patas eran fuertes y robustas, capaces de soportar nuestro peso, nuestra estatura, que sobrepasaba los 3 metros. Vinimos caminando de África o de la India, de Madagascar o de la Antártida. Igualdad. En esa época eran un solo continente y el continente era nuestro. Cuando nos encontramos solas, no nos importó. Nuestro nuevo hogar tenía comida suficiente. El clima era bueno. Apenas había depredadores. Apenas había depredadores. Nuestra extinción comenzó a mediados de 1250, cuando llegaron los maoríes de las islas del norte. En pocos siglos nos comieron a todas.
We came to this island over land long before it split into two, long before it was called Aotearoa. We can't remember when we lost our wings, but don't even display their vestiges anymore. Why would we? Our legs were strong and sturdy, able to bear our weight and even support a height of almost 10 feet. We arrived here walking from Africa or India, from Madagascar or Antarctica. It's all the same now. They formed one continent at the time, and that landmass was ours. It didn't matter when we first realized we were alone. Our new home had plenty of food, the climate was good, and there were no predators. Our path to extinction began in the middle of the year 1250, when the Maoris arrived from the islands to the north. Within a couple of centuries, they'd eaten all of us.
Thanks, Jeff and Eduardo. Next, I have the joy of being able to present to you our lecturer for tonight, Bret Tobalske. It's really sort of interesting to me because I know very few of these bird people. So I've asked them just to tell me something about themselves, interesting or not. Everything they've said is interesting, so I think it's great, so that I wouldn't have to read to you what's printed on the page, because I think you can all read what's printed on the page. And what I found out from Bret is that some time ago he was working as a carpenter in Virginia, I believe, and he began to see wood coming through his shop, which was stamped the Stimson Lumber Company. And he was thinking about woodpeckers at the time. Woodpeckers sort of fascinated him, and he's become, in the meantime, interested in the way they fly, which maybe isn't too fluid from your description, but we'll see. And so he decided to make his way out here to Montana. So it's one of the blessings that the Stimson Lumber Company has given to us, I think. We can be thankful to them for that. Bret is one of our newer faculty members here. He's only been here since 2008. He's an associate professor. And his topic for tonight is fluid motion in flight. So I'm not sure if we're going to hear anything about woodpeckers tonight.
A little bit.
Paul, just a little bit about woodpeckers. But I'm really excited to hear your talk. Bret, come on up.
Thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here. I am going to start in a bit of an aesthetic challenge with this. There's a dualism here. We're going to go on a little bit of a voyage that invokes physics for sure, and I'm assuming you're interested in birds, so it's the confluence of physics and birds with just a little sprinkle of mathematics. But before we get there and dive into that, because that can potentially be intimidating and it shouldn't be, I just want to focus on some aesthetics. Flight itself is a charismatic event that animals accomplish. And this image is the type of work that I use to interpret what's going on inside an animal, which is the theme of this lecture series, inside and out, birds inside and out. We're looking at a sequence of flight where the record of air motion behind the animal gives insight into what it's doing as it's flying. These images, there'll be a few more here. This is an image of a zebra finch. Just look and expose the notion of people who've been fascinated with flight forever, since we've been conscious. And in terms of the techniques that allow us to investigate the mechanisms that birds use, we're lucky. We have lasers, we have computers, other features that allow us to decompose the structure of what they're leaving in their wake and then interpret what's going on inside them, and that's the theme of tonight. These images are obtained using a laser-based system that I'm going to explain in a little more detail. But I want to give a nod to an individual I collaborated with who's a graduate of UM, Master of Fine Arts, 1984, Fernando D'Agostino. She lives in Portland, where I used to be before coming here. And she approached me, interested in the confluence of art and science, and took these types of images and created art exhibits where we collaborated, and these exhibits went all over the world, from China to France and Spain and so forth. My point is, there's a beauty in flight, and what my goal is tonight is to simply hope to expose you to a different way of knowing about it. Again, assuming you're interested in birds, that's why you're here, I just want you to see something different in the air that they move in, primarily. There's penguins and so forth that swim and fly through, but that's not the subject tonight. It's mostly through air. So just seeing the world in a different way is my goal. If I accomplish that, and there'll be some complications and wrinkles and so forth, but we'll hopefully have fun with that given theme. I want to talk about lift, which is with a capital L, because that's the magic thing. Anybody who's flown, that's the magic going on. Origins and costs of lift. Unsteady, and the magic, if you will, of hummingbirds is what I'm going to emphasize, because for the past 12 years or so, I've been focusing on hummingbirds as a model subject for flight. And then drag. So with every positive, there's some kind of cost, and I'm implying some costs embedded earlier, but drag is an obvious thing that birds must deal with. So lift and drag, the composites of flight, is the subject tonight. The important thing is to have a sense intuitive of the differences between us and birds. And I could be substituting insects and bats for this, but we'll stick with birds tonight. For you or I, we walk, and we walk faster, and we might jog and run. And if you ask a horse to do that same thing, or a deer, or what have you, it might walk and trot and gallop. And the cost is linear with increasing speed in terms of the energy being burned per unit time. That's power. So again, the power required to walk is kind of low, to jog is a little bit higher, to run higher still, and it's linear. And that's our world, being confined to the terrestrial environment such as we are. So we're seeing a walk, trot, and gallop cost as a function of speed. It's not the same thing for things that fly. And this works for everything from a mosquito to a finch, to an eagle, to a 747. It's very costly to move slowly. And then we'll explore the mechanisms for why that's so costly. It becomes less expensive at an intermediate speed. And let's see if I have a pointer here. And it becomes more expensive again as costs rise. That's barely visible. So very expensive to fly slowly. There's some minimum speed where it becomes cheaper, then it goes up again. And this is a product of the costs of doing business as a flying thing. Again, this will work from helicopters to planes. It works for hummingbirds to eagles. It works for bats and insects as well. There's a cost associated with producing lift that's called the induced cost of doing business. There's a cost with drag. I think we all have a general sense of what drag is on the wings and the body of the bird. So the cost of producing lift goes down with speed going up, and the cost with drag on the wings and body goes up exponentially with increasing speed. And that gives rise to a U-shaped general curve with flight speed. So again, sticking with what we know, we run, there's an equal and opposite force every time we impact the Earth, but the Earth is so big it doesn't move out of the way. So that process of our locomotion, the fascinating thing with birds, it turns out with fish as well, they're living in a fluid environment. Air is about 800 times less dense than water, but it's behaving very much like a fluid, and that in and of itself is one of the major themes tonight, that air is a fluid, and the dynamics of that determine how birds behave in the air. So what I'm going to show here, I think, we'll find out. Nope, I'm going to have to go to my computer. Make this work this way. These are data from a scientist at Harvard University, George Lauder, just looking at the reaction of a sea start in a fish. My point is that when fish move and they bend their body and undulate, they're imparting forces to water, and the way water responds is to form vortices. This is a sea start or escape mechanism. So the Earth, it reacts, but it doesn't move anywhere because it's so huge. And in contrast, water, and by extension where we're going, air, moves out of the way when something imparts force to it. This is the type of information we obtain from birds at the field station across town. The flight laboratory, this is a pigeon with video showing its wing beat cycle during a flight between two perches. Everyday pigeon, Columba livia. And over here we look at the flow pattern behind. And I want to explore a little bit more about how we obtain that type of flow pattern. So before we do this, I'm going to jump over to play around. I brought lots of props tonight. Let's see. One more time. There we go. Is that me? Yes. All right. So again, I'm going to laminate some physics and math in here, but I think the more important thing is to have fun, and I actually would welcome anybody to just raise a hand if something goes off in left field too far. This is water, right? And the thing about water is we see it. We don't actually see air. We see trees with their leaves moving in response to wind, and that's how we recognize wind, more so than we recognize that something's going on with air. So my point here, I'm just going to drop a little bit of food coloring in here and start to point out that even with this, you get patterns of vortices. Looks a little bit like what you see on the Weather Channel with the hurricane in the Gulf Coast. Actually, I don't even think I can top that. The beauty of what I do is that it's charismatic, right? So what did I do? I smacked this with a little flat plate, and I created a vortex, and I created a pattern of flow that's complicated, and that's the way fluids react. And we're a little bit, as humans, we're a little bit more evident our interpretation of water because we see it. We see it behind a rock. You see vortices. These are sprinkled tea leaves from my wife's stash of tea. And this is just to help visualize what I want to point out here. The point then is, again, we push on something solid. We get an equal and opposite reaction that allows us to run. Water, and we'll get to air in a moment here, behaves by forming vortices in the wake. If I stopped here, I probably would have done my job, right? But we got to get to birds. And apologies to penguins because and other species that fly through the air, fly through the water, excuse me. But in this, I'm just going to create some movement patterns here and point out that there's a reaction that if we can read the tea leaves literally, we can interpret what sorts of forces I'm putting in with my little paddle, okay? And again, just one more time to show, we'll maybe come back to this. I'm going to take a plate here and move this through. It works quite nicely. All right, so extremely dramatic, but water's a little easier than air is. Okay, so in air, we require a little bit fancier. The water won't go away. Let's try again. There we go. Close? Nope, I gotta wait. Patience is a virtue. We use a system called particle image velocimetry. It's a laser-based system. This shows a wind tunnel, which is in my lab. The portion of the wind tunnel here that is visible is where birds fly within. And the overall pattern here is one in which you have a suction fan that pulls air through, and then we use lasers to illuminate the airflow. And the laser flash, I'm going to give you a demo over here within a moment, is something that tracks small particles of olive oil. So this is a fancy vaporizer. And again, if there's a point behind what I'm about to demonstrate, is that we're not aware of what I'm doing with my hand until we visualize it. We're incredibly visual as humans. This is a vapor cloud of micron-sized particles of olive oil. And if I zap this with a laser, or even use just a bicycle headlight, and you get a sense of there's some wind in this room. Now, what I'm going to take is this wing from a goose, which I want to point out, by the way, is from the Phil Wright Museum, an important resource in this context to have access to dried spread wings to demonstrate this or actually study aspects of wing design. So let's just give a little bit of air here, and I'm going to move it around. Now, I'm not a bird, obviously, but I'm inducing an incredible amount of flow. So let this accumulate a little bit. And my point behind this is once we see it, we start to believe it's real. I'm simply going to move this wing like a bird would, and you see the reaction, hopefully. Hopefully the people in the back see. There's an incredible downwash of air just from this simple wing. And my action, which is nowhere near as sophisticated as a bird. There's an equal and opposite reaction that we're leading towards. The wing pushes the air down, and in response, the air pushes the bird up, and that is lift. We reveal that using fancy lasers. And a systems, a close collaborator, a friend of mine, Doug Warwick, looking at a chamber. We're looking down on a hummingbird in this image. And there's a thin sheet of laser light, much fancier than this little red laser that I'm holding, but it illuminates that kind of fog field, if you will, and zaps twice like a strobe, and from that we can obtain information on local velocities. This is a cartoon from NASA demonstrating this principle. You take a couple laser flashes with a bunch of particles moving by, use a computer, and reveal the flow field. And from that, calculate things such as the velocities of the air and other things of interest, such as the forces that an organism or anything, in the case of NASA, they might be interested in a spacecraft, but whatever it's producing in terms of the forces. So again, a cloud of those sort of particles, just like I showed here, this olive oil, illuminated with a laser, tracked, and if they move from time 1 to time 2, you know the velocity was in that direction. That's called particle, because it's particles of olive oil. Laser is used there, but it's particle imaging, velocimetry. All right. So then I'm full of toys tonight. This is a device you can get at science and outreach type, science and industry museums. It's a vortex generator. If I pull this off correctly, hopefully, especially the people in the front will be able to see this. I'm going to try just the light here. All right. This is a vortex generator. Is that working? Yep, fair enough. Let me try it right behind the... I'm smacking the little trigger, and you can keep yourself occupied for long periods of time. You can shoot vortices into other vortices. All right, so the beauty of this is, as a human, you have a sense of flicking this little trigger in a rubber drum and play the drums. But again, my point is we don't have as much of a sense of what goes on with the air. So as we create a bolus of acceleration, it creates a vortex. This type of system, the way I analyze this, is involved with taking that kind of pattern, shooting a laser plane through it, and you get the computer to generate a flow field. So that the downward flow would be this way, and blue is showing upward. And then there's an aesthetic component here. There's a little techie component. It's called vorticity. It's this local spin. All it means is the rotation in the fluid, the rotation in the air. It's shown in yellow because it's going this way. It's shown in blue because it's going that way. And it's the core. It's the eye of the hurricane, if you will, or the eye of the tornado. And from a biologist's perspective, wanting to understand what the animal is doing, that is of interest, it turns out. So we might take everything above a certain threshold and sum that up and calculate things such as forces. It would be like dissecting the little donut of vortex and then using that, reading the tea leaves, to get at what's going on inside the organism. So just to give this a feel, if a bird was taking off, you'd have these boluses of every time it engaged in a downstroke. You'd see an equal and opposite reaction. Another bolus of downwash, equal and opposite, and so forth. That enables the bird to take off. So now we ramp up into a little more formal stuff. All right, lift, the capital L. What's going on with lift? The first thing I want to share with you is that when air moves over a surface, right at the surface, it's stuck to that surface. There's no speed locally there. That's called the no-slip condition. There's no velocity right next to the surface if air is blowing over this tabletop. Okay, there's something like a fan blowing this way. It's not got any speed right next to the surface, and then it gradually gains in speed till it reaches free stream speed above. So what we're after is just a reasonable interpretation of how birds generate lift and are able to fly. That's one part of the equation. Another component is that fluids have viscosity. And when they encounter a surface that's curved, the fluid wants to stick to itself, little blobs of fluid, if you will, little particles or patches of fluid want to stick to themselves. And that creates a fascinating feature you can demonstrate in your own sink. And I would challenge you to go home today or tomorrow, or tonight, tomorrow, whatever, and play around with the Coanda effect, which is simply pointing out that since fluid wants to stick to itself, as it moves around the curve, it's going to continue to follow that curve unless the angle is too great and it'll fall off. Remember my point being water and air behave very similarly. Water moving over a spoon does this. Air moving over the wing of a bird follows the curve. Okay, so that's step one in understanding lift. Lift is hyper complicated and intimidating, but it's a reasonable start. Okay, next then, invoking Bernoulli. And there are many different ways to approach this idea. I brought a golf ball to approach this idea. All right, hopefully everybody hears that. Now, this golf ball, if it's moving, has a certain amount of momentum. And it emanates from Newton's laws. I'm not going to get too heavy here, but it emanates that there's a conservation of momentum, the way the world is. Our reality is that momentum is conserved. So pressure that's exerted on you and I and all the walls in this room is static, because it's not moving in any great extent. That pressure is pushing in on us due to molecules bombarding us from the atmosphere. That's static pressure. That's not everything, but there's no wind in this room, so that's mostly what's defining this room right now. If there were wind in here, we'd have dynamic pressure, and that's pressure associated with movement, or if we will, just loosely speaking, forward momentum. So this golf ball, pretend it's an air molecule and it's beating against the table like all its other friends, its air molecules. That's exerting a pressure because of the change in velocity that's experiencing as it bounces against the surface. The way to think about Bernoulli's theorem as a first pass is that if there is momentum in this direction, right, this way, then if momentum is conserved in the whole system, there's less momentum to beat against the wall. Okay? So let me restate that one more time. If something is causing, whatever it is, wind, flapping wings, a jet propulsion engine, something is causing wind to move air molecules this way. There's momentum this way, and in a fixed system, there's less momentum available to beat against the surface. So going back to now an airfoil, air coming in, it turns out that it follows the upper surface. It would even follow a flat surface inclined appropriately, and we'll see that in a moment. It doesn't have to be asymmetrical like this, but this airfoil, it does follow the surface. That's that Coanda effect. And because it's changing direction as it moves along the surface, technically it's accelerating. It's speeding up. There's a higher velocity. That's the dynamic pressure. It goes faster. It's going faster over the surface, less chance for the air molecules to bounce against that surface, so there's less pressure above. There's greater pressure below. And that's, again, the magic we call lift. There's an equal and opposite reaction, and that's called induced velocity. That pushes the air down. So the air gets pushed down. It gets accelerated downwards. The bird gets accelerated up, and flight is accomplished. So this just summarizes the same thing. If you were, let's say, a bird, sometimes they have little mice, not mice, mites, or lice, or some tiny thing that could be sitting on a feather, going for the ride and observing what's going on. You've got free stream velocity coming in. You've got this fast velocity above. You have this slower velocity below in black. And then what would you see from your perspective just sitting there? It just feels like there's this pattern of wind coming at you. Then you drift down to the bottom side of the wing, and it seems a little bit different velocity. What's shown in red here are the relative terms that a little mite or a louse or what have you would observe moving back and forth. If you took off the average velocity and just looked at what's happening in relative terms, the air is moving fast above, it's moving slow below. So if you subtract off this free stream, it looks to a mite or to the wing itself like air is moving this way. And that is a term called bound circulation, meaning that it's bound on the wing. It's not a reality. All the air is moving past the wing. So pull my wing back here again, orient it the proper direction, which is this way. So wing moving this way, all the air is moving over it and below it. But if you subtract off the rate at which it's going and just say, oh, okay, relatively speaking, it's moving fast up here this way, it's moving slow down here this way. So in relative terms, that creates a pattern of relative airflow like this. So why that becomes important is that that is shed. And so we're going to look at lift production producing this circulation. As it happens, it's always perpendicular to the wing. This process of producing lift gives rise to a force that's like this yellow stick. Okay? So the major first point I want to share with you is that if a bird is gliding, as it moves along, right, that is supporting its weight. And it's going to inevitably slow down or decrease in altitude because of drag slowing it down. What we have in this complicated diagram is simply there's a simpler message than all the little vectors and so on and so forth, and that is when we have lift oriented this way in a glide, an animal gliding will slowly decline in altitude, trading off altitude to maintain speed. What's shown down here in contrast is the miracle of flapping. All right? Take the stick away and just say, okay, a flapping motion moves in this sort of fashion. So an airplane would have a wing to provide weight support, and it would have motor somewhere, a propeller or a jet engine, to provide thrust. A bird is using its wing for both weight support and for thrust, and I'm going to demonstrate that this way. Again, the lift coming about from that distribution of flow around the wing is perpendicular to the wing surface. Gliding would be like this, tilted a little bit, and the animal would just slowly decline. In a flapping mechanism, it's flapping its wing. Which way is that yellow stick oriented? If I make it extreme, it's oriented this way, like a propeller. It's providing thrust. So birds' wings, unlike an airplane's wing, because the wing is fixed, all an airplane wing does is provide weight support. A bird's wing is providing weight support, and it's providing thrust. And it's doing that by flapping. Point number one. Okay, so it accomplishes both weight support and thrust by flapping its wing. A problem arises from that, it turns out, enigmatically. How many people would count themselves, a little show of hands, as a birder type? Reasonable? All right, that's at least half. Okay. So going back to my yellow stick, maybe some people are just not admitting it, right? In a downstroke, the way the stick is oriented, there's an upward component that's providing weight support, a forward component that's providing thrust. The bird moves forward. On upstroke, if nothing changes and it pulls its wing up, that provides weight support, no problem. But which way is the lift oriented? Remember, this is lift. The mechanism is lift. Here it's providing weight support and thrust. Here it's providing weight support. But if the animal wants to fly this way, it's pointed the wrong way, right? It's a problem. And birds have a very straightforward way of dealing with that, which is shown in the lower figure here, and that's flexing their wings, getting them out of the way. So the bulk, I can stick my, I hope that red little dot is visible enough. This bird is flying forward. It's in upstroke right here, downstroke, upstroke. Here's an upstroke. You really get a sense of how much the wing is flexed. This is a great tit from over in Europe. And the point is, behind this image, that on downstroke, they provide weight support and thrust. On the upstroke, they've got to do something with their wings to avoid this negative thrust. Many species flex them completely. Almost, 10,000 species of birds out there. Every one of them pretty well does a downstroke the exact same way. But upstroke is where all the interesting variation occurs. Some of them flex completely, like this. Some of them might turn their wing around and flex them and turn, like we'll see a pigeon earlier. you'll see variation in the upstroke, but it's all a mechanism. The primary flight force is coming from the downstroke, regardless of what circumstance. And then depending on how fast they want to fly or whether they want to take off, accelerate, or maneuver, they may use their upstrokes in different ways. So that's lift. Let's go back to these vortices. The cost. I wanted to explain lift itself as a product of what's necessary to fly. There is an associated cost with producing lift, and that's that left-hand side of the curve. On a wing, if we have negative pressure, relatively speaking, lower pressure above, not negative, but lower pressure, higher pressure, there's going to be a tendency for the higher pressure air below to move over the top of the wing. That creates what are called tip vortices, and this is by no means unique to birds. So it's manifest in large jets. It's a dangerous prospect in airports where airplanes have to be spaced out. These large have so much energy in the wake of these tip vortices that other planes, particularly small planes, could be flipped over and crash as a function of the energy in the wake. You see these manifest as the contrails. So the vortices coming off the wings of jets high up in the air with enough humidity, a little bit of exhaust from the plane, all mixing up and leaving these twin contrails. That is the product of this vortex production at the tips. The more strength there is in this downwash, the more costly it is to fly. And we'll get back to that in a second. But again, my point is, it's not unique to birds. These planes do this. It can be enormous. These are guidelines for small plane pilots to avoid getting mixed up in the mishmash of that vortex. Some examples just from additional plane. They're aesthetically pleasing, and we're going to see some things in birds as well, a crop duster there, or a Cessna jet. It so happens that's exactly the type of tea leaves we read from birds. So an animal in motion, just a simple gliding, it's giving rise to these tip vortices. Wherever it started, if it just started, it would have left this in the wake. This greenish sort of appearance is intended to represent a laser plane that we might use to visualize the flow with that olive oil vapor. And what you see then is this core of circulation left. So as this imaginary animal just started moving, it would leave this vortex in its wake. And we could slice that with a laser, sample twice in quick succession, and look at a couple of terms to determine lift. It happens to have this term called circulation, which is the sum of the area involved in that core and then how intensely it's spinning, how rapidly it's spinning. But from that, we can get at that magical component of lift. And that's exactly what we do across town at the flight lab at Fort Missoula. So again, to give you an example, just to walk through this a little bit, you have flexion of the wings. This is a pigeon viewed from this way, and a high-speed video of a collared dove flying in a wind tunnel, and you get a sense of that flexion. What's happening is this animal moves at about almost 20 miles an hour, about 10 meters a second, is that it's generating lift, it's generating a downwash that the wake would be able to observe if we flashed it with laser light. It's flexing its wings to cut down on this negative thrust. And all the while, you might be looking at this bird, or you might go outside and look at a bird and not realize any of this is going on simply because it's invisible. Right? We don't see it, therefore it isn't real. We just have an incredible bias as humans towards what we see. Let's go back to this curve, this U-shaped curve, and let's now focus on why is it so costly to move slowly. I'm going to focus on hummingbirds, but every animal that flies spends a key fear of taking off from the surface and landing on a surface. And those phases are very slow as well, so the things I'll talk about with hovering and slow flight correspond to takeoff, the very few wing beats right before a bird gets cruising along, and the last few wing beats as it comes into land. Over here, then, again, is the power required, which is the most expensive of any form of animal locomotion, much more expensive in terms of power than running or by far swimming. It's very high under hovering conditions. This curve doesn't even go to the limit here. So we're going to focus right now on this cost, and it's this induced cost, which I want to share with you, and the magic of how animals deal with that. Helicopters do this, right? So we've engineered helicopters with a wheel. It's a pretty good design, right? Hats off to the people who do that. You actually see the effect of the wake, the downwash, being blasted down on the surface of this water. And the master by far, I would argue, of all animals that fly, I'm a little biased because I study them, but hummingbirds. This is a climbing hummingbird from here, Missoula County. Tend to bring them into the lab in May, keep them for a couple weeks, work with them, and let them back on their way. But it is a master of the air, and it's generating a downwash. Even though you don't see it, it's generating a downwash just like that helicopter. I'll prove that in a moment. Turns out that a helicopter, in some ways, is a better design. In terms of energy use, it's useful because there's a wheel there, and we're pretty smart for having invented the wheel. That it's constantly circling around and around and around and pushing down the air all the time. And hummingbirds, because they've inherited four limbs, like you and I have, they oscillate. So they don't move around and around and around in a perpetual circle. And that means they have to stop, turn around, and move back. So the motion that a hummingbird generates, I'm going to actually move back one slide and show you this again with the smoke. It's actually olive oil vapor. People in front notice it smells a little bit like a pizza parlor. Right? But the type of motion that a hummingbird generates with its wings as it flies is a figure eight. Like what we use when a goose can't move its wings this way, but if I were a hummingbird, moving like if you do tread water, if you swim and tread water, a figure eight pattern. That's what a hummingbird is doing. It's turning its hand wing over and generating lift on both halves of the cycle. Okay, very different from the bulk of birds, by the way. You know, all the other 10,000 species out there tend to flap their wings and then fold them up and pull them around, or maybe pull them in, turn them over, and swing like this. A pigeon or a duck does that. Hummingbird, again, keeps things out and does this figure eight pattern. All right, and that's a partial explanation, and it's small. It's got a lot of relative power. Ken Dial talked a lot about relative mass specific, or the power, proportional power. It's got a lot. But that active upstroke is a key component of its ability to hover. It's still not as good as a helicopter in that domain because it's not a wheel. That means it has to stop, turn around, and come back. That notwithstanding, hummingbirds are good at what they do, and they're charismatic and cool. And the thing that's shown here is this amount of air they have to push down, say relative to a helicopter with the same wingspan, same rotor span. They would have to push down more. It's going to cost them a bit more than a helicopter simply because they have to stop, turn around, go back, turn around, go back, and so forth. And that direct cost is manifest with this particle image velocimetry like this. And, again, it's sometimes nice to stop. Just realize it's kind of cool looking. The bird is about 5 centimeter wingspan, 10 centimeter max, right? It's like this big, the end of my finger in terms of size. And it's generating downwash that's about 10 miles an hour right below it. Right? And we see the hint of these vortices here. These are from each downstroke. So to just interpret this, imagine a laser plane, and I'm the bird, and I'm doing this treading water motion, and there's a plane just coming up this way. I'm moving my wings in and out of the plane, and you're seeing what's left in the wake as the wings pass in and out of this thin sheet of laser light. The computer does the calculations, downwash here, and these vortices being shed from the wingtips. This is another view of the exact same thing, and the red box with dashed lines just shows one full downstroke. So anything that happens, it's exactly like footprints, right? Footprints in sand, you can go back and look at them and say, oh, I think that person was running. Here, I can say, I think this hummingbird was doing a downstroke, because that's the time interval over which a downstroke occurred. These boluses of vorticity or spin, and the upstroke is a little less significant, but it's most definitely there. And then another downstroke in formation right now. So again, generating this downwash. It's costly because that air has to be accelerated. And there's a big acceleration. Go from nothing, still air, to something like 10 miles an hour is an enormous cost. And that's why the left-hand side of that curve is costly. The power curve is costly. And we may see kingfishers or kestrels or ospreys, hovering, in quotes, but they're not really. They have to have incoming wind. They are staying in place relative to the ground, but there's no way any bird bigger than a hummingbird can sustain hovering unless it's got wind coming at it, helping. And this, I'll maybe save for questions that people will find interesting, but the thing is, from a hovering bird's perspective, in this room, hovering, if I'm the bird, I'm having to generate all this downwash myself. There's no free ride. So it's an enormous amount of energy required from the musculature. It's incredible. If wind is coming at me, that's already helping my wings function. It's another way of looking at it. There's a mass of air coming along, so I can give it a more gentle push than what I would have to do to the mass of air that my wings can intercept. So I'll leave it at that. It's very costly to just do it all on your own. But if you have some in-current wind, such as typical wind coming left to right on this frame, the kingfisher can accomplish hovering that way. It would not be able to sustain it more than 10, 20 seconds otherwise. Hummingbirds can do it for hours, as long as they have access to food. It's still very costly. And so what I want to now turn towards is some of the ways they've converged with insects in order to accomplish this costly form of flight. This is an airfoil behaving very much like an airplane wing would behave. We're looking at streamlines. We're looking at an increasing angle of attack as it tilts up relative to the incoming air. And then we see stall behind. And I'll play this video at least twice. And it's fully stalled, and an airplane under those circumstances would drop, and with unfortunate consequences, right? Sudden loss of lift with increasing angle of attack. So let's look at this video one more time. So again, streamlines, this is in a wind tunnel, an airfoil, common engineered airfoil, and we have a pattern at which increasing angle of attack, when it does increase, first of all, notice the induced velocity. The air is being pushed down. That's the equal and opposite reaction. Over 5, 10 degrees, all is good. A little bit higher, still being pushed down. You see some turbulence back here, a hint that things might be going awry. And a slightly higher angle of attack is going to be kicked in, and it goes into full stall. You just see the flow separate completely. So again, a plane would crash under those circumstances. Another major point I want to share with you, I'll stick my neck out a little bit because I've studied in hummingbirds and a few other species now with students in my lab, but all birds in slow flight generate lift under conditions that would cause stall in airplanes, which is cool as a general observation. They have the capacity to generate what are known as, and this is not just birds, turns out insects and bats, I got to tip the hat to them as well, right? And for that matter, we'll see in a moment, samaras, like the maple seeds that spin, they do it too. And now I'm going to come back to the water bin and show you that practically any flat plate moved the right way does this. But that notwithstanding, the key to this performance is called the leading edge vortex. So an airfoil at a low angle of attack, or a low angle relative to incoming air, generates lift and drag. Everybody's okay with that. You turn it completely perpendicular and it behaves very much like a paddle, pure drag. And you can see this, and I'll demonstrate it again in a second here, which is vortices shed behind. But at an appropriate high angle under some circumstances, especially with rotation and a short duration of swing like this, you can see a standing wave of vorticity form on the leading edge of the wing. And the function that this has is to increase lift. It increases force in general. It increases drag as well. But this is exactly where hummingbirds, nectar-feeding bats, and then every other bird out there that takes off in the first few wing beats of its flight, or the last few wing beats as it lands, it's using its wings in this way. And what it's doing is it's boosting force production for its circumstance. Let's go back to the water here. Looks gross. All right, so I'm going to demonstrate with this flat plate. This is a flat piece of plastic, and I just move it in the correct fashion, and you'll see that there, it's almost too easy. There's a leading edge vortex forming. You follow? You see it? It can't persist under these circumstances. And by the way, if you catch this in the back, we'll also see over here the shed vortex. But again, as I move this forward, there's the leading edge vortex forming. Under translation, this would be linear motion like this. It naturally forms, so it's not that mysterious. It turns out that can't be sustained. If I had a bigger pool of water here, I could move it a little further, and eventually that would separate completely and stall. So part of what's going on in animals that fly is that they're cueing their subtleties of wing motion in such fashion, and they stop and turn around and start over again before that thing is shed off and it goes into stall. So it's called dynamic stall. Again, I can't really demonstrate it here. I can demonstrate the leading edge vortex, but I can't demonstrate any more distance to show that it would separate from the wing and go into stall with this simple plate. By virtue of rotating and turning around, they avoid that stall. They beating the birds, the insects, and the bats, and the samaras. An individual named David Lentig, he's now at Stanford University. At the time, he was a postdoc working with these maple seeds. But the point is, any thin, small, suitably shaped flat object spun in the right way can generate a leading edge vortex. And a hummingbird wing is most definitely in that category: small, thin, and flat. And we'll show how these motions converge on each other in these videos. A friend and collaborator of mine, Ty Hedrick at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, studies hawk moths. And notice the pattern of motion in these hawk moths. They're about the same mass, 2 or 3 grams, less than an ounce. A hummingbird, the calliope, and the samara moving around. And if you look closely at the flow field around this maple seed, right on the surface, you'll get a sense of the leading edge vortex there in that pattern. How many hundreds of million years, evolutionary-wise, you have to go back to realize these things have converged on the same aerodynamic mechanism? And these are images then showing the leading edge vortices, the wave, if you will, standing on top of this flat wing that allows it to boost force production. It is a key component for hummingbird ability to hover. It's key element in insect flight, and so that's one mechanism, and it's not unique. I don't have a slide here, but it's been shown in bats as well. Group working in Sweden have shown this in the nectar feeding hovering fruit bats and these samaras. Now, I've been interacting in a number of angles of the work that I do, fascinate engineers and mutually, to develop flying autonomous vehicles, or bird bots, if you will. These two individuals, this little, we're looking at a turn that's been modeled, and I'm going to show you some images to give a bit of better insight. But again, these data were obtained right across town in the flight lab from a calliope hummingbird. They show up in early May or maybe very late April, stick around for a couple of months. This is a very careful modeling of its motion and its body form. These are my collaborators on this type of work. And computational fluid dynamics accomplishes a phenomenal application of computers to model what the flow would be. So we're going to look at, during this downstroke starting right now on the right-hand side, these leading edge vortices forming. And this seems fast. We'll just let it go for a while, but it seems fast. Remember, the hummingbird is beating its wings almost 50 times per second. So it's just a blur, but it's slowed down. We take this information and use that to model the flow characteristics using an iterative process on computers, very fancy iterative process. So those leading edge vortices are key, and the text down below is supplemental, but the point is they're actually modifying by the position of the wing, they're modifying the intensity of circulation in those leading edge vortices to accomplish that turn. Another view of the same thing, just giving you a feel for this, that maneuvering can accomplish small changes, subtle changes in the angle of the wing relative to how it's being presented to the air. That modifies that wave sitting on top of the wing, and then that's used to accomplish this turn, this yaw type of motion. Certainly when I see things like this, I feel very lucky to have access to these technologies. Going back to the start and stop problem, there's a nice solution in spite of the fact that a hummingbird or a moth or a bat, moves its wings back and forth, stops, turns them around, and comes back. It turns that during this phase of rotation, they can actually entrain air and produce some lift. And that's what this slide shows. I mean, it's not mysterious in terms of intuition once you see what's happening. Again, I can show it again. It's as simple as that. Notice how much air is getting whipped downwards as I swing this goose wing around, right? If it's moving down, that gives the potential for the bird to move up. That's called rotational circulation. And they absolutely capitalize on this in terms of thinking of an insect moving its wing this way, as the figure is showing. The bluish line shows what kinds of forces it would produce if it were just moving back and forth. But if it times its rotation appropriately, the red lines show the peaks in force that kick in if it times the rotation appropriately. And lo and behold, hummingbirds with this figure 8 pattern and rotation timed with reversal absolutely do that. The trajectories shown here are the tips of the wings shown in black dots and circles. They're indicating the trajectory if a bird was holding still and it's moving through this arc. From above you would see this pattern for the wrist, for the wingtip. And from the side you get a bit of a figure 8 pattern, about like what we do when we tread water, roughly. And this is just showing it flips around from 0 degrees. So as a function of the wing beat during downstroke, it's going back and forth above and below 0 degrees. Just a fancy way of showing that it inverts its wing. But during that phase then, what we're looking at right now is right over the shoulder of this hummingbird from above. And a laser light is illuminating this flow field, and we're looking at the air that's entrained by the wing rotation. So to summarize, and we have leading edge vortices boosting force in a hummingbird. And at the rotation ends of its downstroke to upstroke transition or up to downstroke transition, it's entraining air and helping to produce lift. So in spite of the fact that it doesn't have a wheel, it has to turn its wing around, it's maximizing the full extent of its excursion across the way. And again, to emphasize that, the fact that these are vectors, black arrows, that just shows air velocity. This wing is just turned around and starting downstroke, and so all of that motion is exactly what I showed you early on as circulation. So that's the left-hand side of the curve, and that's some ways in which nature has dealt with dealing with the expense, the power costs of slow flight. And hummingbirds are the extreme performers in this regard, but much of what I've just shared with you applies to other birds when they take off. Let's now look at the other side, the fast flight side. All right, to this curve, this U-shaped curve, we've been dealing with induced costs, the cost of pushing down the air. But these two curves here are for the wings and for the body, and drag goes up as a function of increasing speed. And what I want to share with you are tail effects, the tail, and this green woodpecker. Somebody asked Linda, I guess it was I going to get woodpeckers into this talk? And sure enough, there it is. And the body shape itself, engaged in a bound with the wings tucked in. All right, so let's think now about a sphere, an orange sphere, such as, for example, this big enough to see basketball. Let's think about air coming at it. All right, invoking Bernoulli again. Total pressure in this room. There's static pressure on the basketball, just like on your head and my body and so forth. But now, if I move this forward, there's airflow relative to the basketball. Or if I had a fan over here blowing air this way, some in-current wind, there'd be wind coming at it. All right, so this would have dynamic pressure. There's static pressure on the balloon. The air molecules come along and slam into the front. Zero velocity, right at the stagnation point. All the pressure possible. The dynamic, due to whatever force, something was propelling it or wind was coming at it, everything arrests, and there's a lot of pressure then on the front end. Now, D'Alembert, a French scientist, elucidated, if you think about it this way, the air has to move around, or the fluid has to move around the object, but then it ought to separate at the backside. And when it does separate, so it's going to speed up as it moves around, that Coanda effect. It's going to come slow down as it moves the backside, slow down to 0, and separate off. Real fluids never behave that way. It's paradoxical because they don't. In any water flume or running air past this, it doesn't behave. It slams in, you get an increase in velocity around the curve, back down to 0 here, and separation. In contrast, the way the real world behaves is like this below. All you have to do is go out to the Clark Fork, the bridge, pedestrian bridge, look for one of the rocks, look behind it, and you'll see this exact pattern. Or play around with some water in a coffee cup tomorrow. The way the real water and air of our world behaves, it's got viscosity, which in this sense is like the friends, the little molecules want to stick to each other. They want to hang out together. So as this air slams into the front and moves around, it's heading this way, and it's saying, hey, friends, hang with me. Right? That's viscosity. It's come along for the ride. So it's coming over the surface, trying to go around, but actually it's got its own momentum in this direction, and it pulls some of its friends along, and that causes vortex separation, a turbulent wake right behind anything. So an object in a stream, you will absolutely see a vortex generation zone right behind it. The problem is, right, high pressure. All this dynamic pressure plus the static pressure is already there. Boom. On the backside, you've still got velocity, and that's dynamic pressure. And as a consequence, the static pressure is less. And the net result is wind coming this way. Oh, we got drag on this basketball. That's drag. An imbalance. There's pressure on the front end that's not balanced by pressure on the back because of flow separation. So that absolutely works. And that's a separate, and I'll go into the question of why golf balls have dimples, but I'll leave that if you're curious. I do have an answer for that. But it's the wake that is evidence, again, that there is a cost, a drag cost. One way to accomplish a reduction in drag is to be suitably shaped, and lo and behold, birds' bodies, as our trout, as our submarines, roughly cigar-shaped or fusiform. And they're shaped in such a way that the taper of that body helps to recover some of that velocity, recover some of that static pressure. And so it reduces the wake profile, if you will, the width of the wake. As the air moves around, sure, you see an acceleration, the streamlines get closer together, but it doesn't separate until the very end here, so you have a minimal flow separation zone, where the separation of these streamlines indicates the velocity is slowing down, and that's minimizing drag. Because where velocity is lower, the streamlines are further apart, the static pressure is greater. And if you're following me, that means the static pressure is helping to reduce the drag because it's pushing somewhat back that way. So a streamlined bluff body like that, and lo and behold, yet again a woodpecker, pileated woodpecker, they are shaped that way. But another major point I wanted to share with you, among many functions of the avian tail, being a splitter, helping to keep flow attached off the backside is absolutely one of them. This is a starling, a carcass that's been frozen. This is work from Maybury and Rayner in England in 2001, taking in a wind tunnel with flow. You see an intact tail and the lack of a tail with a much wider wake. So lacking the tail, the flow separates earlier, there's more drag. So again, the tail's used for many things, but among them, a splitter to help keep flow attached is a function of the avian tail. All right. The last thing I want to share with you is something that actually got me started. When I came out here after having been a carpenter and was working under the guidance of Dick Hutto, who will be talking in a few weeks, studying woodpeckers in clear-cut areas where the Forest Service had left snags for them to nest in, and watching this intermittent flight style that's very characteristic of woodpeckers. Most small birds do it. And that was the first inkling that drew me towards flight, is this fascinating flight style called flapping and bounding, where the bounding is tucking their wings in and bulleting through the air, literally about like a human ski jumper. Right? There's a flapping phase, flap, 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 gain altitude, and bound. We're looking at a female zebrafinch doing this in a wind tunnel at about 8 meters a second, 16 miles an hour or so. High-speed video just demonstrating that the bird folds its wings completely against the body like it's perched and bullets through the air. This is so common. So just look at any small bird out there, and other than the swallows that aren't around this season, everything else out there is doing this if they're small. Up to, say, the pileated woodpecker in size, maybe 200-300 grams. Why? Before I explain the absolute why, I want to share with you that this can be readily observed outside, and I would challenge you to do exactly that. This video does kick in. This is up in the lower rattlesnake, good friend's house, Missoula Avenue. We're looking at a black-capped chickadee taking off from a feeder, engaging in flapping and bounding. So you can see this in your own backyard. And it's pretty freaking insane, right? Like I said, all the math, all the physics notwithstanding, it's just plain cool what they can accomplish. It's just aesthetically pleasing. Amazing. That's a black-capped chickadee, just a mile from here up in the rattlesnake. Here's what's going on. In that posture, they're organizing flow with their body and with their tail to support some of their weight, and they're reducing drag on their wings for a period of time. So the short answer is, it's a great strategy if you want to fly particularly fast. And a little bird like this is a great prey item for virtually anything, from a cat to an accipiter or what have you. The rapid takeoff that they engage in, you would think, on one hand, that just flapping your wings as fast as possible and getting going would make the most sense. And it certainly makes sense from an energetic standpoint. You could never make a case for hovering and every once in a while closing your wings, because gravity is the enemy. But what is happening is that these birds have relatively round wings, and they generate a pattern of flow over their body that is pushing down, and they're getting body lift from that, and they're getting a reduction in drag that helps them accelerate horizontally more quickly. These figures are PIVs, so you should be familiar with this kind of pattern. This is a prepared taxidermy-mounted bird that died for other reasons than my study. And taxidermically mounted in a wind tunnel looking from behind, and you're seeing downwash, and you're seeing these vortices over the tail. There's a cartoon of the same thing, with blue being up, red being down, and more evidence of the same thing. You sample right in the middle, it's red, that means down. You move out towards the edge, 20 millimeters out, that's upwash. It's not unique to birds, and in fact, suitably designed cars actually generate the exact same kind of pattern. Being appropriately shaped, a bit like a cigar, or fusiform shaped, and oriented properly into the wind, with one major addition, and that is the tail. Even without the tail, they can generate this downwash. This is the taxidermically mounted specimen with no tail. But with the tail, the lift relative to the drag is much better. Right? So the tail is functioning on the one hand to help reduce drag in fast flight. That's that splitter effect. And then the other is that it's assisting in generating body lift during these bounding intervals. Back, my major foundation for the work I did for my PhD many years back, Jeremy Rayner modeled this mathematically, and this shows that U-shaped curve with flight velocity as a function of power cost. And this flapping and bounding never energetically makes sense in slow flight. But once you get going faster, it absolutely makes sense. Cutting down on drag from the wings momentarily, translating that into forward velocity. And just as an observation, say for example off Cape Cod, radar stations will observe masses of migrants leaving, heading south, for example, and seeing signatures of this flapping and bounding interval on the radar images. So this pulses you can actually identify according to roughly the size of the species. So this is no pun intended, a bit of a whirlwind tour of fluid dynamics in bird flight. And to get a couple of main ideas across, I hope. But part of it is that the process of producing forces in the air that generates vortices. And those are like the tea leaves in the water. We can read them and get real insight into the biology of that kind of locomotion. That hummingbirds have converged on insect mechanisms. It turns out bats and samaras also do some of that. But it's not unique. It's very costly to fly slowly. And a couple of key features, that leading edge vortex and the circulation that's accomplished at the end of the stroke help hummingbirds accomplish what they do. Tails, again, among many other things like maneuvering, just generating lift, being used to advertise towards potential mates, on and on and on. But one of the features of tails is that it helps keep flow attached on the backside of that bird's body and reduce drag. If it didn't have a tail, it would have more drag. And then flapping and bounding, extremely widespread in small birds, medium-sized birds, but it is accomplished in part by producing body lift and reducing drag on those wings. So I have so many people to honestly thank that I just put many and all here instead. We've got a great lab of students. I've had many positive interactions with postdocs and so forth. I want to give a special nod to my mentors. And I say standing on the shoulders of giants. When I came out here 20 plus years ago, 25 years back, the first individual I met on this campus was Dick Hutto and his wife Sue Reel, and they welcomed me into their home and went up and started a project involving woodpeckers that essentially full circle brought me right back to this podium today. So a major nod to him. Andy B. Winter, a huge influence on my life as a postdoctoral advisor. And Ken Dial, you saw him talk last week. He's a force unto his own. That I think I'll leave it at that. Much appreciated, though. And among many, 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 many collaborators, a special nod, the most valuable player nod, even if I'm not good at sports illusions, Doug Warwick. You saw a picture of him, and Don Powers, another collaborator. This is the field station across town. And I guess I would say extend a welcome. I mean, a major component of my research is actually outreach, and I'm pleased to be talking to you tonight that way. But if people want to tour some of these facilities, not everybody at once, but I'm certainly open to hosting and allowing you to see some of these laser light shows in action and so forth. Thank you.
Are you going to have a mic? Yep. Susan, you have a mic? Okay. So as usual, thanks a lot, Bret.
Absolutely.
We'll have time for question and answer. I wonder if it's possible to bring the lights up. And maybe if not, maybe we'll be able to see. Let's give it a try. I don't think anybody's up. Okay, so question. Here's one right here. Susan?
I've got a loud voice.
Okay.
Can you explain golf ball?
Sure. Absolutely. I'm going to explain it with basketball, but it was noticed back historically that old golf balls would fly further than new golf balls when they were smooth, and that absolutely led to the dimpling. And the phenomenon, okay, so pretend this is now a golf ball, and if it's very smooth, what's going on is that flow is occurring around the surface, and that, again, the Coand effect, air is attempting to follow, but it can't. Eventually it separates. And the momentum that that air has is a product in part of its velocity. Remember that no-slip condition attached right to the surface is very low velocity. The dimpling creates turbulence right on the boundary. So, I'm using my hand on this basketball to represent the boundary layer. What the dimpling causes is turbulence, which energizes that boundary layer and helps keep the flow attached. So a dimpled golf ball, the flow will stay attached, and you'll have a smaller wake on the backside just because there's more energy right in that boundary layer.
How many golfers are there? Okay, good. Who else has a question?
Oh, well, we need it for the recording.
Okay, question on vortexes. I probably missed some of this, but are they always a negative? Always a negative. Okay.
That's a great, no, I was nodding because that's an awesome question. And no, they're not always a negative. There's been incredible work with insects. Michael Dickinson, who's now at Caltech, was in various other places, but insects, it's been shown that they actually recapture. So they generate this vortex, and there's this thing spinning in the air, a bit, not being trivial about it, a bit like a surfer would ride a wave. If you move your wing appropriately relative to this circulating air, you can harvest some of that energy. That's never been shown in birds or bats, but it has been shown for insects. But there's one other cool feature. I don't have the slides to pull up and show you, but I'd encourage you to go look at it. These ibises in Europe. There's a phenomenal study just published last year. Okay, picture a V formation of geese. Now this was worked out in ibises, not geese, but this is the basic idea. I'm a goose, I'm the lead goose in the V. And I'm generating these vortices behind me. And then there's a bird off and behind to the back, all right? And again, this is work out of Royal Veterinary College in the UK, Alan Wilson's group, Jim Usherwood and others with ibises. They had a ultralight, a plane, they got these birds imprinted and they monitored and showed that the birds sit there in the wake of the bird in front of them and move their wings appropriately to harvest the air coming off the other bird's wing. That's long been hypothesized to be the case in geese. It remains to be shown for geese, but indications are it's likely.
Okay, I've noticed driving and getting too close to a semi, there's a point in there where your car's been shaking around and you get up real close, which is not the thing to do. But it suddenly smooths.
Sure,
out
absolutely.
right up close.
Yep. Again, with a basketball,
Those are vortexes?
it is. And it's a wake, so the vortices looking at air coming this way, imagining that's the truck, right over the back, there are these vortices forming. You get right in the quiet zone, and in a way, you're actually being pulled along. And in fact, for people that race bicycles, for example, motorcycles, that's called sucking the wheel. You suck onto the person's wheel in front. You're literally in the wake. And that's what's happening behind the semi.
And one other thing, airplanes, recently, the manufacturers have added these, what they call winglets. What effect does that have on, I think the flight is smoother, maybe less vortexes?
Yep,
I don't know.
I owe him money for all these great questions. That's a wonderful convergent pattern between engineering and birds. If you look at a picture of a vulture, look at a vulture from real life, whatever, you see the upturned primary feathers. It doesn't, crows, many other birds, primaries out, gliding, and the feathers at the tips are turned up. So going back to that inevitable vortex production, it's a cost. I'm going to actually use this goose wing. This is something that a student in my lab, also first name of Bret Clausen, is studying. These feathers aren't separated and they're not bent up. But again, if this is a wing flying towards the screen and you have this tip vortex being formed, and that represents a cost because this portion is essentially lost as far as lift production is concerned. So the governing hypothesis is that that flow bending up and around gets that vortex off the wing. And it is absolutely known for airplanes that it reduces fuel costs by about 5 to 7%, which is not trivial. And here's the funny thing, and this gives you real insight into the way natural selection and evolution works. Going back to the planes, the same effect would be accomplished just by having longer wings. It doesn't quite look as cool, and I'm not making fun of that. It's true. You could just have a longer wing and get the same effect. But there's design constraints in terms of hangar size and ignoring the cool factor of the upturned wing. It does require more space. So there's a message there. I, again, don't have lots of figures to show you, but picture an albatross with a very long, skinny wing, which has low induced power requirements. It's very efficient at flying, and in part because that long, skinny wing out here, there are tip losses, but it's 90% of the wing is not suffering those. Where you see those upturned primaries and the marginate primaries are in birds that soar a lot, but they're on land. So a red-tailed hawk or a turkey vulture. And that tells you something, that there's probably a selective pressure associated with something, other things not bumping into trees or surfaces or what have you, to have a short wing, but to make the best of it, relatively shorter than an albatross, which is not suffering that constraint. So I guess the hypothesis we're working with is, that they have, the ideal design is probably an albatross wing, but if you're not going to have it long like that for some other reasons, such as you don't want that slamming into a ponderosa pine tree when you take off, the upturned primaries and the emarginate primaries are a solution.
So do you think our airline tickets are going to get
The gas went down? No. It's a one-way. Right. It's a one-way ticket, yeah. Yep. Do I select or go ahead?
I understand that owls have especially quiet wings. I suppose that has something to do with vortex. How is that connected to this?
Yeah, that's a great point. If you have I'll make a little plug for the Phil Wright Museum. If you want to see some owl feathers and you've never had an owl in your hands, the feathers that are on the specimens have a velvety, almost, I guess velvet is the right term, roughly, kind of a fuzzy appearance relative to, say, this goose wing. So it's not that it's been fully studied, but it does have something to do with vortex production, absolutely. And the simplest way to convince yourself of that, I would encourage you to just go on a bicycle and go downhill, right? Like Duncan Drive over in Rattlesnake or something. That noise you hear is turbulence being shed behind your head, literally. The roar of wind is turbulence. So there's most likely a component of that fuzzy, velvety surface that is keeping the boundary layer from generating too much turbulence in owl wings. But that's an open hypothesis. Nobody's ever demonstrated it. You can absolutely put a microphone on an owl and see that it's extremely quiet. You can see that the wings are fuzzy, but the link between the two in terms of the types of, that remains to be done. It may, not joking, that'd be an interesting dissertation project for somebody.
Are you a pilot or do you hang glide?
No, no. I have too much respect for gravity. Yeah. Yep. Right. I don't have any urge that way. And oddly enough, in truth, I think for humans, the closest you can get to experiencing, if you want to experience what birds truly experience, is to ride a bicycle. You figure on a bike, mountain bike or road bike, whatever, and you're using your leg muscles, not your pectoralis, but still, you're using your own muscles to crank along. You get up to the same speeds they do. Even the big birds, like eagles or whatever, roughly easy 20 miles an hour if you're working at it, or certainly if you're going downhill. And I think that feeling is close enough for me.
Just wondering, does the hummingbird create lift on its backstroke? Yeah.
Yeah.
You're saying it moves its wing backwards. It's doing
Yep.
the same thing, right?
Right. So this was long thought to be the case. I was a good fortune to actually be the person with my collaborators, Doug Work and Don Powers, to demonstrate it for sure. It does, yes. So it turns its wing over, and when it does that inversion, it generates lift. It doesn't generate as much lift as the downstroke. The downstroke does about, if 100% is the total lift generated, the downstroke does about 75% of it. The upstroke does 25, but still, under those extreme conditions, every little bit counts.
It's because of the shape where the wind, instead of going like this, is being sucked under a little bit.
This goose wing is nice to show you that this is called camber. It's curved. The hummingbird wing is remarkably flat relative to this. And it may have been, it may have passed quickly, but let me show you that it's this is just a pure flat piece of plastic. And if you hold it just right, you can generate, and you move it appropriately, you can generate some down. It might be very costly, but if it's flat and you move it the right way, you can generate some downwash. So that causes nausea. but all that perpetual downwash was just from the simple plate. And so, yeah, it doesn't have to be cambered. This is not a good design for generating lift this way. This is terrible, which explains partially why birds don't do that. But a flat wing can, especially if it's held the right way.
And a bird that's flapping, right here. A bird that's flapping, and is there any effect on the angle of the feathers as it goes up, so there's less resistance and there's more airflow through the wing and on the downstroke?
Yes. Let's see. I'm not sure I'm understanding you correctly. Like
Going down.
Yep.
They're fixed, so there's no wind.
Yeah. Okay.
Going up, do the feathers change? So
Right. Yes. They do in various ways. If I can pull this off with, let's see, show you this pigeon again. It's kind of an extreme example of that very feature. Early on, I showed a pigeon in this talk. Find my cursor here. Let's see. There it is. Let's go way back to the beginning somewhere. Yeah, here. All right. So, yeah, you see that separation? Kind of a Venetian blind. Yeah. Yep. So there's a lot going on in that pigeon. In addition, if you just listen to a pigeon take off, you'll hear that pop sound. That's called a clap. It does clap its wings and peel them, which is on the back side, over its back. I can't do it with my arms, but behind its wings clap together and peel apart, and that generates a little pulse of air. But yeah, they manipulate their wings. So this is related to what the hummingbird is doing. The hummingbird is taking it to the extreme and turned the whole wing over. Pigeons, I don't have videos, unfortunately, tonight, but ducks, mallards taking off do this routinely. Ospreys, just go on YouTube or wherever, go on the web and just type osprey takeoff, and you'll see this incredible Venetian blind appearance. So what's really going on is they're bringing their wrists over their head somewhat, turning the hand wing over and spinning it this way. And that's very different from birds. So relatively speaking, the pigeon, like this goose, has a relatively pointy wing. Relatively. Whereas something like a finch or a magpie has a relatively rounded wing. And those birds with rounded wings, many of them out there, instead of doing that in slow flight, they literally just bring their wings completely close to the body and start over again, get them out of the way.
Yeah, given the question on the tail and reducing drag, why the variety in different shapes of tails?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, a major component in that and a huge aspect of bird biology research into bird biology has involved sexual selection. So one way to think of it is that the ideal design from an aerodynamic standpoint is a bit like a triangle. Okay, so if a bird, imaginary bird here, and its tail, and you're looking at the tail flared and it formed a triangle, that would be the optimum for producing lift relative to drag costs. And then you start to look at birds like a magpie that has this tail that if you spread it out and looked at it, it would go down like this, and then it would have this long middle part. All that long middle part, all available aerodynamic evidence is that just creates drag. Now, both male and female magpies have that, so let's leave that alone for a second. But let's look towards barn swallows in Europe that have very long streamers on the outside. And that's been quite a vigorous area of research to tease apart how much of that streamer length is due to female choice as a handicapping, as an index, a true signal of male health. Like, hey, I can catch insects all day in spite of having these streamers that cost a lot. Right? And for the European barn swallows, that seems to be that beyond a certain length, these tail streamers are costly. So the interpretation is that it's due to female choice. And that's at least one.
Yes, you suggested early on that only small birds could hover, at least in level flight or calm wind. Now, is that because of of larger birds' inability to generate enough energy to support their weight, or is it also in part to their not having evolved anatomically the ability to flip their wings over like a hummingbird, or is it a combination?
Like almost everything in biology, I'll take the fifth and say it's a combination. But not jokingly, a major component is the size, right? Last week, Ken Dow presented a number of features that varied with size, that smaller birds can literally fly circles around bigger birds. Even not a hummingbird, but a chickadee can fly, right around the trunk all the way to the top and go mob a crow and fly circles around it. And crows can mob eagles. So that the relative power available compared to what they need to fly is greater in small things. And one way to think about that is they're small and they can move their wings extremely fast by virtue of that. So that's a portion of the ability to generate lots of power. Another metaphor, if you will, it's like comparing a Porsche. It's got a small engine with high RPMs and it can just zip right up a hill, whereas a larger, just by virtue of the way the engine works, and the pistons have to move back and forth, they're bigger and they move slower. A bigger vehicle can't generate as much. It can generate more absolute power, right? Absolute terms, but it's relative to its mass. So that's the major feature. And it's only the very smallest bats that can hover. But any small bird, a finch, a chickadee, a nuthatch, whatever, warbler, can certainly hover for 20 to 30 seconds. But I had a rufous hummingbird when I was in Portland working. We brought one into the lab. To get him acclimated, we put it in the wind tunnel with plenty of sugar water to feed on. It was a female, and the female will fly around and look for a way to get out, and she did that for an hour and 15 minutes without stopping. That's like 40 wing beats per second for an hour and 15 minutes, every once in a while stopping to feed. And eventually she just calmly, okay, I guess, I guess I'll sit now. So Yes, it's size, and yes, it is that they haven't evolved with the ability to invert their wings.
Oh,
In the corner, huh?
yeah, hi. So thinking about the geese working together behind each other, what about the birds that, swarm together or like school like fish and move in unison?
Yeah.
What
That's a
is the
fascinating
study of
question, right? I mean, it may be disturbance even in certain, with so many animals like that, you may have issues of turbulence causing perturbations. In a fascinating study, it turns out, from the exact same group that did the work with the ibises, they put physiological measuring, like heart rate monitoring devices, a person named Jim Usherwood, with pigeons, and measured them flying in a flock around and around in circles. You can get pigeons to do that and then come back to roost and get your recording apparatus, and showed that that flocking behavior cost energy above and beyond what it would be to just simply fly by yourself. So the addition of all of the birds around, creating kind of a random array of eddies and vortices, in that study was indicated to be a cost. Yeah, I would say that remains to be studied, honestly. If everybody's behaving in tight unison, and sometimes you can see high-speed videos that they seem like they're timed down to the microsecond or millisecond in incredible unison, and that hasn't been studied. That's a great possibility, a nice hypothesis that aspects of that may facilitate performance.
If somebody asks me a question I can't answer, I just say, why don't you go home and do some research, write a paper, and come back. And
Come back to me? Sure, right.
Then they never ask a question I can't answer again. So it's a technique, I recommend.
Okay, that sounds like a plan.
I have about 8:30. If you have further questions, let's give our professor